Matthew 14:5. And though he wished to put him to death. There is some appearance of contradiction between the words of Matthew and Mark, for the former says that Herod was desirous to commit this shocking murder, but was restrained by the fear of the people, while the latter charges Herodias alone with this cruelty. But the difficulty is soon removed. At first Herod would have been unwilling, if a stronger necessity had not compelled him reluctantly to do so, to put to death the holy man, because he regarded him with reverence, and, indeed, was prevented by religious scruples from practicing such atrocious cruelty against a prophet of God, and that he afterwards shook off this fear of God, in consequence of the incessant urgency of Herodias, but that afterwards, when infuriated by that demon he longed for the death of the holy man, he was withheld by a new restraint, because he dreaded on his own account a popular commotion. And here we must attend to the words of Mark, Herodias lay in wait for him, 359, which imply, that as Herod was not of himself sufficiently disposed to commit the murder, she either attempted to gain him over by indirect wiles, or labored to find some secret method of putting the holy man to death. I am more disposed to adopt the former view, that she employed stratagems for influencing the mind of her husband, but did not succeed, so long as Herod was prevented by remorse of conscience from pronouncing sentence of death on the holy man. Next followed another fear that the business of his death should excite the people to some insurrection. But Mark glances only at what prevented Herod from yielding immediately to the entreaties of the prostitute, for Herodias would have wished that, as soon as John was thrown into prison, he should be privately executed. Herod, on the contrary, reverenced the holy man, so far as even to comply willingly with his advices. Herod feared John. Now the fear which is here mentioned, was not a dread arising from a mistaken opinion, as we dread those who have obtained some authority over us, though we reckon them to be unworthy of the honor. But this fear was a voluntary respect, for Herod was convinced that he was a holy man and a faithful servant of God, and therefore did not dare to despise him. 360. And this deserves our attention, for though John knew by experience that it was, in many respects, advantageous for him to have some share in the good wishes of the Tetrarch, yet he was not afraid to offend him, when he could find no other way of securing that favor, than by wickedly conniving at a known and disgraceful crime. He might indeed have protested that he did not at all consult his private interests, and that he had no other object in view than the public advantage, for it is certain that he requested nothing from motives of ambition. 362, but that Herod yielded to his holy counsels, which had a reference to the lawful administration of the kingdom. But as he perceives that he has no right to accept this kind of compensation, which would procure for him some kind offices by betraying the truth, he chooses rather to turn a friend into an enemy than to encourage, by flattery or silence, an evil which he is laid under the necessity of reproving with severity. John has thus, by his example, furnished an undoubted rule for pious teachers, not to wink at the faults of princes, so as to purchase their favor at this price, how advantageous soever that favor might appear to be to the public interests. In Herod, on the other hand, the Spirit of God exhibits, as in a mirror, how frequently it happens that those who do not sincerely worship God are nevertheless willing, in some measure, to obey his commands, provided that he will grant them some indulgence or abatement. But whenever they are hard-pressed, they throw off the yoke, and break out not only into obstinacy, but into rage. There is no reason, therefore, why they who comply with many sound advices should be well satisfied with themselves, till they have learned to yield and surrender themselves unreservedly to God. Matthew 14:6. And when Herod's birthday was kept, the evangelists now begin to relate the stratagem by which Herodias at length succeeded in a design which she had long meditated, the taking away of John's life. The opportunity was afforded to her by an annual festival, when Herod was celebrating his birthday. It is scarcely possible that such magnificent preparations should not draw luxury, pride, unbridled merriment, and other crimes, and likewise many other evils, along with them. Not that there is anything wrong in the mere act of preparing an expensive banquet, But such is the tendency of the human mind to licentiousness, that when the reins are loosened, they quickly go astray. The ancient custom of observing a birthday every year as an occasion of joy cannot in itself be disapproved, for that day, as often as it returns, reminds each of us to give thanks to God, who brought us into this world, and has permitted us, in His kindness, to spend many years in it. Next, to bring to our recollection how improperly and uselessly the time which God granted to us has been permitted to pass away, and, lastly, that we ought to commit ourselves to the protection of the same God for the remainder of our life. But nothing is so pure that the world shall not taint it with its own vices. A birthday, which ought to have been held sacred, is profaned by the greater part of men with disgraceful abuses, and there is scarcely a single entertainment at all costly that is free from wicked debauchery. First, men drink more freely; next, the door is open to filthy and immodest conversation, and, lastly, no moderation is observed. This was the reason why the patriarch Job was in the habit of offering sacrifices, while his sons were feasting alternately in each other's houses. Job 1-5. It was because he thought that, when the guests invite one another to mirth, they are far from maintaining due moderation, and sin in a variety of ways. Thus it happened that Herod, intending to give a rich entertainment to his guests, permitted his wife's daughter to dance. Hence, too, it appears what sort of discipline existed at his court, for, though most people at that time thought themselves at liberty to dance, yet for a marriageable young woman to dance was a shameful display of the impudence of the strumpet. But the unchaste Herodias had molded her daughter Salome to her own manners in such a manner that she might not bring disgrace upon her. And what was the consequence? The wicked murder of a holy prophet. The heat of wine had such an influence on Herod, that, forgetting gravity and prudence, he promised to a dancing girl, that he would give her even to the half of his kingdom. A shameful example truly, that a drunken king not only permits himself to behold with approbation a spectacle which was disgraceful to his family, but holds out such a reward. Let us therefore learn to be careful in anticipating and resisting the devil, lest he entangle us in such snares. Mark 6:24. And she went out, and said to her mother, we need not wonder that Herodias attached so much importance to John's death. The conjecture thrown out by some that she was actuated by revenge, is not at all probable. It was rather the dread of being cast off that inflamed and tormented her, as it usually happens that, when adulterers are visited with feelings of uneasiness, they become ashamed of their own lust. But she hoped that this crime would bind Herod more closely to her than ever, if the disgrace of a pretended marriage were washed out by the blood of the prophet. That her power might be more secure for the future, she longed for the death of that man whom she imagined to be her only opponent, and this shows us the wretched anxiety by which a bad conscience is always tormented. John was detained in prison, and the haughty and cruel woman might have issued orders that no man should converse with or approach him, and yet she has no rest, but is oppressed with anxiety and alarm, till the prophet be removed out of the way. This likewise serves to show the power of the Word of God, that the voice of the holy man, even when shut up in prison, wounds and tortures in the keenest manner the mind of the king's wife.